Hello and welcome to Vendor Trash. Is the name a reference to my drawing skills, my opinions, or both? That's for you to decide. The role of a class developer is not an enviable one. No matter what you do, people are going to get pissed about it. If you leave a class or spec untouched, people are upset that you're neglecting it. If you change anything, you risk players being upset that you ruined their spec. Of course, conventional wisdom says to just iterate until you get it right, and once you do, don't fix what isn't broken. Of course, the tricky part is nobody will ever agree on when something is right. Sometimes these reworks can be massive to the point where they basically replace a spec. And while this can bring a lot of excitement, it can also mean the death of a spec that you love. This is the story of one such spec, the original Mistweaver from Mists of Pandaria. Now, by this point in my gaming history, Frostmage was firmly established as my forever main, and I was and still am loyal to Holy Priest as my main healing spec. But in case anyone needed reminding, Siege of Orgrimmar lasted 14 months, which means I had plenty of time to dabble in others. The introduction of flex rating, which evolved into today's normal difficulty, made this experimentation all the easier. As a result, I wound up playing a decent amount of both Destruction Warlock and Mistweaver Monk. And MoP was one heck of a time for class design. As one of my friends often likes to put it, every spec was overpowered in the best way. Of course, monks had just been introduced in this expansion, and I feel like, at least in this spec, they hit it out of the park right away. There was the whole aspect of fist weaving, but I didn't engage in it too much, and I'm not going to cover it here. For regular mist weaving, though, their single target rotation is the aspect that has best survived to this day. It basically boiled down to Soothing Mist, which you would channel on a target to heal over time and also drain your mana over time, and Enveloping Mist, which did have a cast time, but if used while casting Soothing Mist, was instant. This was not only a potent hot in its own right, but it also amplified any other healing that you were pumping into the target. So of course you would cast it during Soothing Mist. I remember back in the day hearing a lot of criticism that Mistweavers didn't have strong single target healing, and I couldn't have found this to be further from the truth. I think the only merit to that is that you couldn't have strong single target and strong raid healing at the same time. I should also note that casting Soothing Mist would periodically grant you some chi, and that Enveloping Mist cost chi to cast. I don't believe these two spells are exactly the same nowadays, but they're pretty similar. Moving on to group healing, we had Renewing Mist, which does still exist. I believe back then it was about a 24-second hot with an 8-second cooldown. You would apply it to a primary target, and then after so long it would spread to a second and later a third target. This meant that if you kept it on cooldown, you could potentially have Renewing Mist on up to 9 targets at a time. Even better was that the spread mechanic had smart healing to it, so it would basically always go to an injured target if one was available and in range. And this ability also generated chi. In a group healing situation, you would most often use this chi to cast Uplift. Uplift was simply a powerful group heal that affected all players currently benefiting from Renewing Mist. So in any situation where you needed to do at least a little AoE healing, you would just keep Renewing Mist on cooldown and then Uplift as needed or to prevent chi capping. Nowadays, Renewing Mist is similar, but it just spreads if it heals a target that's at full HP instead of always spreading. Uplift stuck around for one more expansion. WoD gave it a short cast time, which really killed my enjoyment for the spec, although I wish I had played it a bit more before Legion completely overhauled it. Among many other changes, Uplift was removed and Vivify and Essence Font were brought in to replace it. I really enjoyed the playstyle of both the single target and group healing, and it honestly wasn't too hard to switch between the two of them. You just couldn't do both of them to full effect at the same time, which seems reasonable. And it meant you could be great at whatever kind of healing the raid needed you to do. I guess the main criticism you could levy against it, although mind you this isn't a criticism that I personally care about, is the fact that the spec was a bit non-interactive for a healer. Especially with the raid healing, you essentially just cast Renewing Mist on cooldown and uplifted almost regardless of what the incoming damage profile was. That could certainly be seen as a degenerate form of game design, so while I don't agree with steering away from that, I can understand why they may have. The Legion rework definitely brought the spec more in line with how other healers play, which I think is a bit boring and kind of a shame, but that's just me. Another aspect of MoP Mistweaver that kind of got phased out over time was the Sea Cow. See, whenever you would spend chi, That is, whenever you would cast Enveloping Mist or Uplift, you would generate stacks of the Sea Cow. You could store up to 20 stacks of it, and whenever you wanted, you could start channeling the Sea Cow to consume 1 stack every half second, and as you would do this, you would restore mana. Basically, you would want to do this whenever you weren't busy doing anything else and didn't need to be moving. And in rare situations like lengthy boss RP, you could just channel it for 10 seconds and consume all 20 stacks. Now, as long as you were remotely mindful of your Sea Cow stacks and didn't let them cap out, you could basically go forever without having to worry about running out of mana. Of course, this sounds extremely overpowered, but I'll quote my friend again, every spec in Mists of Pandaria was overpowered in its own way. Yes, a Mistweaver's mana pool was essentially the Energizer Bunny, but it did require you to do a bit of maintenance that most healers just don't have to worry about. That felt like a fair trade-off to me, and it was fun. The spec essentially had 3 resources that operated in a triangular fashion. You would spend your mana primarily on Soothing Mist and Renewing Mist, which would generate Chi, which you spent on Enveloping Mist and Uplift, which would generate the Sea Cow, which you would consume to give you back the mana to cast Soothing Mist and Renewing Mist some more. It was simple, elegant, and beautiful. But again, it probably stood out a bit too much and got hammered down. Sort of outside of all of this, I want to talk about Healing Spheres and the Mistweaver Mastery. Healing Sphere was basically a spell that let you put a little green ball on the ground, and when you or anyone else who was injured ran through it, you would get a heal. This was actually more useful for Brewmaster and Windwalker monks, especially in PvP, whereas for Mistweavers, the spell itself wasn't that great. But where things did get interesting was the original Mistweaver Mastery, Gift of the Serpent. Almost any healing spell you used would have a chance to generate a healing sphere on the ground near somebody. This was generally considered to be a terrible mastery, and people begged for it to be replaced. It eventually was in Legion with Gust of Mists, and that is a shame because that mastery is way less interesting. A lot of the complaints surrounding Gift of the Serpent was that a lot of players felt that healing went to waste. Yeah, healing was being put out there, but players had to run across it to get any of it. And even if they did so, it could often come at the cost of damage or causing them to detour and get hit by another raid ability. It's similar to the complaints that always surrounded Lightwell, which was always considered useless because players would have to actively click on it to get any healing, and nobody trusted them to do that. Of course, Lightwell received many buffs over the years that essentially made it into passive healing. However, I feel like a lot of the complaining around Gift of the Serpent was perhaps a bit misguided. The best way to use it was never to expect your raid members to actively run into the spheres. As long as you had the glyph that extended your healing spheres from lasting 30 seconds to 3 minutes and 30 seconds, which was pretty much mandatory, then eventually you would just flood the area with so many healing spheres that players would run over them incidentally, essentially turning it into passive healing. I feel like most healers just couldn't get past the lack of control they had over it. But if you were actively healing the whole time, it was almost hysterical just how many healing orbs you could spawn. I did the healing proving grounds on my Mistweaver, and the NPC pathing there is obviously very much straight lines between them and the enemies, which meant that most spheres did get completely ignored as it was very unnatural movement. The place basically became an ocean of green balls, so the raw output was definitely there, at least in a 5-man situation. Unfortunately, and this is my only real criticism with the mastery, is that every healing spell had a different modifier on it that would affect the chance of each individual heal to generate a sphere. Basically, so spells like Renewing Mist and Uplift didn't have hextuple or more chance to spawn them. But the modifiers used for your AoE healing were a bit low, so you actually didn't wind up generating many more than you would in a 5-man situation. But of course, this is extremely easily fixed by just tweaking the modifiers. Unfortunately, Blizzard abandoned this mastery in Legion, and I don't think they have any intention of ever looking back at it. So yeah, all in all, I absolutely loved Mistweaver, and it was largely left intact for Warlords of Draenor, but almost completely reworked for Legion, and has mostly stuck to that design philosophy ever since. I have no doubt that most Mistweavers nowadays prefer the current form, or don't even remember the old one, and honestly, my opinion on the matter shouldn't even hold that much weight. It was at best my 3rd most used spec for one expansion, and I haven't even raid healed in like a decade anyways. But I still loved playing it, and I think it's worth remembering what it was. was. And heck, if I really want to, I'll be able to play it again soon in MoP Classic, although I doubt I'll actually wind up playing that. Classic is one of those things that always sounds fun to do, but I never actually wind up, doing. But yeah, for the longest time, I've kept my monk as a Mistweaver in the vague hope that it would eventually return to some semblance of what it used to be, but I recently realized I just don't enjoy the spec as it is anymore, and bit the bullet and respect to Brewmaster. It's a bit sad because I enjoy the Mistweaver fantasy a lot more, but I'm making the best of a slightly unfortunate situation. Anyway, for today's drawing, I decided to go with Lily Stormstout. Lily is one of my favorite Warcraft characters of all time. I absolutely fell in love with the character during the Valley of the Four Winds questing. I love her dynamic with her Uncle Chen. I think it is beautiful and fun, and I love the youthful sense of adventure and snark that she has. She tells you to check behind waterfalls for treasure, and gives you flack for accidentally splashing muddy water in her eyes. Probably for the better, we don't see much of her after Mists. She does come back in Legion for the Monk class Hall campaign, and of course she was one of the very first healers added to Heroes of the Storm. Heck, I dare say she's my favorite healer from HOTS. She's kind of one of the tankiest healers in the game. Her passive ability lets her move more quickly and regenerate her cooldowns faster whenever she's attacked, and her E ability let her blind and slow nearby heroes, which made her very sturdy and quite a reliable healer. For a very long time, Lily's representation pretty much kept her as a perpetual child. This is fairly understandable because that's how we know her. She is a child character. But time has moved on, and so has Lily. I was actually rather surprised to find out that Blizzard used her again recently as the focal character of exploring Azeroth Pandaria. Going off of the synopsis, we find out that she's been spending most of the last decade living in Mistfall Village in the Vale of Eternal Blossoms, and basically became a bit stagnant. Her Uncle Chen was finally settling down and helping out with the Stormstout brewery, and she didn't really know what she was supposed to do with her life. She even feels a bit dismayed that she's lost some of the youthful moxie and fearlessness and adventurousness that she used to possess. The book basically tells the story of her and Chen taking Catelyn the Blade on a tour around Pandaria. For those who don't know, Catelyn was a Blackwater raider from Booty Bay who had interacted with Lily in other external materials prior to Mists of Pandaria. They started out adversarial but became friends by the end of it, and so when Catelyn lands in Pandaria here, she decides to hit up her old friends. By the end of the book, Lily's basically come to the conclusion that yes, she does want to be a wanderer just like her uncle was, and like she was as a child. She wants to see what the world has to offer, and she feels a bit foolish for ever having forgotten that. But it's pretty relatable. I feel like a lot of us tend to forget what we really want out of life as the realities of life sort of beat us down and make us forget that to be truly happy, we just need to follow our inner child and the dreams of that inner child. So at the end of the book, while Uncle Chen stays behind in Pandaria, Lily decides to hitch a ride with Catelyn. She's still pretty iffy on if she wants to actually join the pirate crew, but she is welcome on board either way. And we do get one illustration of 20-year-old Lily at the end, and it seems to be a pretty natural midway point between the Lily we're familiar with and an adult female Pandaren. She is a bit more slender and wears her usual style of clothing, and yeah, I hope many fun adventures await her, even if we don't necessarily get to hear about them. For the background here, I just put her in the Jade Forest. It seemed rather fitting, and I'd already done the Valley of the Four Winds, and I decided to let her summon a tiny manifestation of Yu'lon because she is a Mistweaver, and HOTS sort of represents that both with healing brews and summoning cloud serpents, even if we never really get to see her have a spiritual connection to the August Celestials. So the Yu'lon part might be a little bit of headcanon, but just let me have it. So I think I will wrap things up here. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next week. Bye-bye!